The plantation did not announce its secrets out loud. It absorbed them into the rhythm of daily life, into the sound of footsteps crossing wooden floors before dawn, into the smell of ink and candle wax that lingered in private rooms long after doors were closed. Monticello stood high above the land, orderly and elegant to outsiders, yet inside it functioned like a quiet machine where every movement was observed and remembered. Thomas Jefferson's public life was built on words, carefully chosen and endlessly debated, but the private world he inhabited was ruled by silence. Enslaved people learned early that silence was safer than truth, that survival depended on knowing when not to look, when not to speak, and when to forget what the eyes had seen. Among those who lived within the house was a young, enslaved woman whose presence blended into the background until it no longer could. She was not loud, not defiant, not careless. She performed her duties with the kind of precision that came from fear rather than loyalty, moving through rooms where history was written, carrying trays, folding linens, standing close enough to power to feel its weight but never close enough to claim protection from it. Over time, subtle changes began to appear, changes so small they could be dismissed at first as coincidence. She lingered less in doorways, avoided sudden movement, kept her hands folded protectively at her waist. Other enslaved women noticed before anyone else did. They always did. There is a shared awareness that develops among people who have learned to read danger in the smallest signs. A missed chore, a moment of dizziness, a step taken too carefully. No one asked her directly. Questions were risky. But eyes followed her, and when she turned away, heads leaned together briefly, voices lowered to breath. Pregnancy on a plantation was never private, never joyful, never free of consequences. It meant vulnerability multiplied, punishment intensified, and scrutiny sharpened. It meant a future decided by someone else. As the weeks passed, what could not be said began to shape the atmosphere of the house. Doors closed more often. Conversations stopped when certain people entered rooms. Jefferson himself seemed unchanged to visitors, composed and measured, yet those who served him daily sensed tension beneath the surface. He walked the halls later at night. Papers stayed on his desk longer than usual. The household moved around him carefully, as if avoiding something fragile that might shatter with the wrong sound. Rumors, once formed, do not need confirmation to feel real. They survive on repetition and fear. In kitchens and quarters, the story took shape without names, without accusation, only implication. A woman carrying a child who could not be explained, a man whose authority ensured no questions would ever be written down. The most dangerous rumors are the ones that never have to be spoken fully. They exist in glances, in pauses, in the sudden hush that falls when someone unexpected enters the room. Eventually, the truth reached the person it could not avoid forever. Jefferson's wife lived within the same walls, yet increasingly apart from them. Illness had already weakened her body, but this was different. Those closest to her noticed the shift in her posture, the way she held herself as though bracing against something unseen. When she understood the meaning of the whispers, there was no dramatic reaction, no explosion of anger that history could capture. Instead, there was withdrawal, a retreat so complete it startled even those accustomed to suffering in silence. She stopped appearing at meals regularly. She limited her interactions to only what was necessary. Her eyes no longer lingered on the life of the house. They passed over it as though it belonged to someone else. In an era where women were expected to endure betrayal quietly, her response followed the rules of the world she lived in. She did not confront power. She absorbed it, and in doing so began to disappear long before she physically vanished. The plantation continued its routines because routines are designed to survive moral disruption. Horses were fed, letters were written, guests came and went without knowing what lived beneath the surface. Yet everyone who lived there understood that something fundamental had shifted. The enslaved woman's condition became impossible to hide completely. Efforts were made to move her out of sight when visitors arrived, to assign her tasks away from central spaces. Protection, if it could be called that, came not from kindness, but from the need to control scandal. Pregnancy transformed her from invisible to dangerous. Her body carried evidence, and evidence threatened reputation. She was no longer just an individual, she was a risk. Jefferson's wife, meanwhile, became increasingly isolated. Those who attended her noticed she spoke less, slept poorly, and avoided areas of the house associated with shared memories. Letters from this period grew sparse, restrained, stripped of emotion. It was as though language itself had failed her. Silence became her only remaining form of control. To the outside world, nothing appeared unusual. History favors what can be documented, and this moment resisted documentation. There were no confessions, no recorded disputes, no official acknowledgments. What existed instead was absence forming slowly, day by day, until it became noticeable. Servants spoke of rooms left untouched, of personal items no longer moved, of the feeling that a presence had faded while the body remained. The enslaved community understood this kind of disappearance. They lived with it constantly. People vanished from their lives without explanation, relocated, sold, erased. But to see it happen to the mistress of the house unsettled even them. Power did not protect against grief, it only disguised it. The pregnancy advanced, and with it the tension tightened. Everyone waited for something to happen, though no one could say what that something would be. Plantations thrived on the appearance of order, but order required suppression, and suppression always came at a cost. This was not a story of passion or romance, as later generations might try to frame it. It was a story of imbalance, of consent distorted by ownership, of lives shaped by forces that offered no safe choices. As the summer wore on, the house felt heavier, as though the walls themselves were listening. Jefferson continued his work, continued writing, continued presenting himself to the world as a man of reason and enlightenment. But reason has limits when it refuses to confront its own contradictions. Those contradictions lived within his household, breathing, growing, waiting. By the time autumn arrived, the situation could no longer be managed by silence alone. Something irreversible had begun, and everyone within those walls knew that whatever came next would not be written honestly in history books. The truth would survive only in fragments, in whispered memories passed down by those who had no power to preserve them officially. This was how many American stories began, not with declaration, but with quiet knowledge shared among the unheard, while the rest of the world looked away, convinced that greatness could exist untouched by the suffering hidden beneath it. As the weeks passed, the plantation settled into a strained version of normal, the kind that appears functional on the surface while slowly breaking underneath. News did not arrive with certainty or proof, only with the weight of repetition. What began as guarded glances and cautious silence hardened into quiet acceptance among those who lived within the house. Everyone knew something had happened, even if no one could point to a single moment when it became undeniable. The enslaved woman's condition was no longer a matter of speculation. It was confirmed not by words, but by the way others adjusted around her, shielding her from sudden scrutiny, guiding her through crowded spaces, stepping in when her strength faltered. On plantations, women learned to protect one another in small ways because large protections did not exist. Meanwhile, Jefferson's wife became increasingly removed from the life she once managed with discipline and grace. She did not accuse. She did not demand answers. Instead, she retreated inward, a response shaped by years of living within rigid expectations where emotional expression was permitted only if it did not disrupt male authority. Those who attended her noticed she asked fewer questions about household matters, as though she had relinquished ownership over the space entirely. Meals were missed without explanation. Invitations were declined. The rhythm of her days grew irregular, dictated more by exhaustion than intention. To the outside world, illness provided a convenient explanation. It always had. But within the walls of the house, people sensed that something deeper had taken hold. Silence was no longer just a habit, it had become a barrier. Jefferson himself avoided extended time in shared spaces. When he did appear, his demeanor remained controlled, almost deliberate, as if composure alone could stabilize the situation. He did not speak of rumors, and no one dared raise them. Power does not require discussion to enforce itself. It operates through what remains unsaid. The enslaved woman was gradually reassigned, moved away from areas where guests might notice her. These changes were presented as routine adjustments, nothing more, yet everyone understood their purpose. Pregnancy created evidence, and evidence threatened reputation. The woman became a problem to be managed rather than a person to be acknowledged. She was never asked how she felt, never offered reassurance. Her future, like her present, belonged to others. As her body changed, so did the behavior of those around her. Some treated her with increased caution, others with resentment, as though her condition had brought danger upon them all. Fear does that. It fractures solidarity even among those who need it most. Jefferson's wife, now largely confined to private rooms, began to fade from daily awareness. Servants noticed her belongings remained untouched for days at a time. Dresses were left folded where they had last been placed. Personal letters went unanswered. Her presence became something remembered rather than experienced. In a house built on hierarchy, this absence carried meaning. When the mistress withdraws completely, it signals disorder no one is willing to name. Those closest to her later recalled that she spent long hours alone, often by the window, gazing outward without focus. Whether she was contemplating escape, resignation, or simply enduring the passage of time was impossible to know. In that era, women were rarely granted narratives of their own suffering. Their pain was absorbed into the household and explained away as weakness. The enslaved community observed this transformation with a mixture of recognition and distance. They knew what it meant to disappear while still breathing. They lived that reality every day. Yet witnessing it happen to someone whose life had once seemed protected unsettled them. It challenged the belief that status alone could shield a person from omission. Meanwhile, the pregnancy advanced, and with it came increasing urgency to contain the situation. Decisions were made quietly, often without explanation. The woman was relocated more frequently, her movements restricted under the guise of care. Care, however, was indistinguishable from control. She was monitored, not supported. Any tenderness she received came from fellow enslaved women who understood the risks she carried simply by existing. Jefferson's wife continued to recede. At some point, people stopped expecting to see her at all. Her absence became normalized, which is how disappearances succeed. They rely on adjustment, on the human ability to accept loss without closure. Letters from her hand, once regular, became rare and stripped of emotion. They spoke of practical matters only, devoid of reflection or intimacy. It was as though she had decided that feeling, once exposed, offered no protection. The house itself seemed altered by this withdrawal. Rooms felt hollow, sounds echoed longer than before, even the light appeared different, filtered through curtains that were no longer opened with care. Jefferson remained engaged with the world beyond the plantation, corresponding with colleagues, managing affairs, maintaining his public identity. To those who encountered him externally, nothing appeared amiss. This dual existence was not unusual for men of his position. Public virtue often existed separately from private reality. Yet inside the house, the cost of that separation was becoming unbearable. The enslaved woman's condition eventually became impossible to conceal entirely. Visitors noticed her absence more than her presence, which in itself raised questions. Explanations were offered casually, always plausible, always incomplete. Illness, reassignment, family needs elsewhere. The truth did not need to be convincing, only sufficient to discourage. Curiosity. Curiosity was considered impolite when directed toward powerful men. Jefferson's wife, now largely confined to memory within the household, ceased participating in shared life altogether. Those who entered her rooms described them as unchanged, frozen in time, as though she had stepped away briefly and might return at any moment. But she did not. Her withdrawal was not dramatic. It was methodical. Day by day, interaction by interaction, she removed herself until there was nothing left to remove. The enslaved woman, carrying a child whose future was already decided without her input, became increasingly isolated. She existed within the house but outside its narrative. No one documented her experience. No one recorded her fear or her thoughts. History would not preserve her voice, only the consequences of her existence. As autumn deepened, the plantation braced itself for whatever outcome would follow. Everyone sensed that the situation could not remain suspended indefinitely. Something would change, someone would leave, someone would be moved, someone would be erased. In houses like this, resolution rarely meant justice. It meant concealment. The quiet tension that settled over Monticello during this period was not unique. It mirrored countless other households built on the same contradictions, where ideals of liberty coexisted with systems of domination. What made this moment different was not the act itself, but the silence that followed. Silence protected reputation, preserved power, and ensured that when history was later written, it would be incomplete. Those who lived through it understood that truth would survive only in fragments, passed quietly from one person to another, carried not in documents, but in memory. Section by section, absence by absence, this was how the story moved forward, toward a disappearance that would never be properly explained, and toward a legacy shaped as much by what was hidden as by what was recorded. By the time winter settled over the plantation, the absence had become undeniable. It was no longer a matter of missed meals or declined appearances, but a complete withdrawal that altered how the house functioned. Jefferson's wife was no longer seen moving through shared spaces, no longer issuing instructions, no longer correcting small errors or acknowledging daily routines. Her role, once central, had dissolved quietly, leaving behind a vacuum that no one attempted to fill directly. Servants adjusted instinctively, redistributing responsibilities without formal orders, relying on habit rather than instruction. This kind of adaptation was familiar to them. They had lived through disappearances before, though usually those disappearances came with the sound of chains or the movement of wagons. This one came wrapped in silence and respectability. When asked about her condition, those closest to the household offered the same restrained explanation: illness requiring rest, privacy necessary for recovery. It was an answer that satisfied curiosity without inviting further questions. People accepted it because acceptance was easier than confrontation. Within the walls of the house, however, people knew better than to expect her return. Time has a way of clarifying intentions. Days passed, then weeks, and nothing changed. Her rooms remained closed, maintained only enough to prevent decay, as though preserving them mattered more than restoring their occupant. The sense that she had stepped out of the story entirely began to settle in. Jefferson did not publicly acknowledge the shift. He continued to receive correspondence, to manage affairs, to present himself with the same composed authority that had always defined him. Those who interacted with him noticed subtle differences and increased formality, a careful distance, even within familiar relationships. He avoided discussions that lingered too long on domestic matters. His attention turned outward, toward work and ideas that existed beyond the immediate reality of the house. This outward focus did not erase what had happened, it merely placed it out of sight. Meanwhile, the enslaved woman's situation grew more precarious. As her pregnancy progressed, her ability to perform physical labor diminished, which in turn increased scrutiny. On plantations, usefulness often determined treatment. Reduced productivity invited resentment, not sympathy. She was moved again, this time more permanently, placed in quarters where her condition would draw less attention. Her interactions narrowed to a small circle of women who assisted her quietly, offering what comfort they could without drawing notice. They understood that attachment carried risk. Any display of concern might be misinterpreted as defiance, yet they also understood that isolation could be just as dangerous. Balance was everything. Jefferson's wife, now effectively absent, became a subject of speculation beyond the plantation as well. Visitors who had not been present for months noticed her disappearance and asked polite questions. Polite answers were provided. The story of illness expanded, grew flexible enough to explain prolonged absence. In that era, women's health was often used to explain away emotional suffering. The narrative fit neatly into existing expectations. No one pressed further. The world accepted what it was prepared to accept. Inside the house, however, the cost of this narrative became increasingly visible. Without her presence, the household lost a stabilizing force. Small tensions escalated more easily. Decisions that once required minimal discussion became sources of quiet disagreement. Authority remained intact, but guidance was dim. Inished. This imbalance affected everyone, from the highest-ranking servant to the lowest laborer. The enslaved woman felt this shift acutely. She existed in a space where attention was dangerous and neglect equally so. She was aware that her body represented something unresolved, something inconvenient. No one explained what would happen after the child was born. She was not asked what she wanted, because what she wanted was irrelevant within the system that governed her life. She learned to anticipate outcomes without being told, a skill developed through years of observation. The child would not belong to her in any meaningful sense. That knowledge settled over her with a heaviness she carried silently. Jefferson's wife, though unseen, continued to influence the atmosphere of the house through her absence. Servants spoke of her rarely, and when they did, it was in careful tones. Mentioning her felt inappropriate, as though acknowledging her existence threatened the fragile arrangement that allowed daily life to continue. Those assigned to tend to her rooms reported minimal interaction. Sometimes she requested small items, sometimes she did not. Her voice, when heard, was subdued, stripped of authority and emotion. It was the voice of someone who had withdrawn not just from others, but from herself. Whether she had chosen this withdrawal or been driven to it by circumstance was impossible to determine. In systems built on silence, intention is always ambiguous. As winter deepened, rumors began to circulate beyond the immediate household, vague suggestions that something was amiss. These rumors lacked detail and direction, making them easy to dismiss. Without confirmation, they faded quickly, absorbed into the countless unverified stories that surrounded prominent figures. History favors clarity, and this situation resisted it entirely. Jefferson's wife was neither officially gone, nor visibly present. She existed in a liminal state that defied documentation. The enslaved woman's pregnancy reached its later stages, bringing with it increased anxiety among those responsible for managing the household's reputation. Plans were discussed quietly, often in her absence. She was informed of decisions only when necessary. Her consent was neither sought nor considered. This was not seen as cruelty but as order. On plantations, order justified everything. Jefferson maintained control through distance. He did not involve himself in daily management of the situation beyond what was required to ensure discretion. His detachment reinforced the power imbalance that made accountability impossible. Those beneath him understood this and adjusted accordingly. No one challenged the arrangement. Challenge implied consequence. As the birth approached, preparations were made discreetly, supplies were gathered, a location was designated. Everything was planned to minimize disruption. Disruption, not injustice, was the true enemy of the system. Jefferson's wife remained absent throughout these preparations. Her non-participation signaled finality. Whatever bond had once existed between her and the life of the house had been severed. She had removed herself from the narrative not through departure, but through refusal. Refusal to witness, refusal to engage, refusal to legitimize what had happened through acknowledgement. This refusal was perhaps the only agency left to her. Those who lived through this period later described it as a time when the house felt suspended, caught between past and future without resolution. Everyone sensed that the birth would mark a turning point, though no one could articulate how. The enslaved woman, aware that her life would be irrevocably altered, focused inward, conserving energy, bracing herself for an outcome she could not influence. Her reality, like that of so many others, would not be recorded. It would exist only in memory, passed quietly through generations until it blurred into legend. As winter began to loosen its grip, the stage was set for an event that would force the household to confront what it had tried so hard to avoid. The disappearance of Jefferson's wife had already rewritten the internal story of the plantation. What followed would determine how that disappearance was understood, remembered, or erased altogether. History would later move forward, as if this period were merely a footnote, but for those who lived it, it was the moment when silence solidified into legacy. When the child was born, it happened without ceremony and without witnesses who would later speak of it openly. The timing was controlled, the location chosen for discretion rather than comfort, and the people present understood that what they were participating in was not meant to become part of the household's official memory. Births on plantations were common, but this one carried a weight that made even routine actions feel dangerous. The enslaved woman endured the pain in near silence, not because she lacked voice, but because experience had taught her that noise attracted attention, and attention invited consequences. The women who assisted her worked quickly and efficiently, their movements practiced, their expressions unreadable. They had delivered children under far worse circumstances and knew how to keep fear from their hands. When the child finally arrived, there was no celebration, no acknowledgement beyond what was necessary to ensure survival. The infant represented proof of something the household had gone to great lengths to deny. Proof required management. Within hours, decisions were already being made about the child's future, decisions spoken aloud only among those whose roles demanded it. The mother was informed of none of it directly. She learned what she needed to know by observing what was taken from her and what was left behind. Jefferson did not attend the birth. His absence was deliberate, calculated to maintain distance and deniability. This distance reinforced the structure that protected him. He could later claim ignorance of details, involvement only at a remove. Power thrives on such separations. The child's existence was acknowledged only insofar as it required logistical planning. Names were considered but not discussed publicly. Records were minimal, vague enough to avoid scrutiny. In the days following the birth, the enslaved woman was allowed little time to recover. Care was provided only to the extent necessary to return her to usefulness. Motherhood under bondage offered no exemption from expectation. The child remained with her briefly, long enough to establish dependence, then was gradually integrated into the system that would shape its life from the beginning. This transition was subtle, spread out to avoid emotional disruption that might draw notice. Jefferson's wife did not appear during this period. Her continued absence spoke louder than any confrontation could have. Those assigned to her rooms reported that she remained secluded, requesting little, speaking rarely. Some believed she knew of the birth, others believed she chose not to know. In either case, her refusal to re-enter the life of the house signaled a boundary she would not cross. This boundary, once set, altered how everyone else behaved. It was as though the household had agreed collectively not to force her back into a narrative she had rejected. Over time, the child's presence became normalized in the way all injustices do when repeated without challenge. To those born into the system, it was simply another life beginning under the same conditions as Countell's. Others. Yet those who remembered the tension leading up to the birth understood its significance. They watched closely to see what would happen next. What happened was not dramatic. There was no sudden removal, no public declaration. Instead, the household adjusted again, absorbing the event into routine. The enslaved woman was reassigned, her responsibilities modified to accommodate her condition while still extracting labor. The child was cared for according to the minimal standards afforded to enslaved infants. Jefferson's wife remained absent, her room still preserved, her name spoken only when necessary. Over time, visitors stopped asking about her entirely. Absence, when prolonged, loses its power to shock. It becomes background. This was perhaps the most effective erasure of all. Jefferson continued his public life uninterrupted. He wrote, corresponded, and engaged in the intellectual pursuits that would later define his legacy. To those who admired him, his private life appeared orderly, respectable, untroubled. The contradictions between his ideals and his household were rarely addressed, and when they were softened by language and distance. The enslaved woman and her child existed outside these discussions. They were not part of the story being told to the world. Within the plantation, however, the consequences of the birth continued to unfold quietly. Relationships shifted, alliances formed and dissolved. The enslaved community adapted, as it always had, to new realities imposed without consent. Some felt resentment toward the woman, unfairly assigning blame to her for the increased scrutiny and tension. Others felt empathy, recognizing her lack of choice. Both reactions were shaped by fear. Fear was the most reliable tool the system possessed. Jefferson's wife's continued withdrawal eventually took on a different meaning. What had begun as A.B. sense became something closer to disappearance. There were days when no one saw her at all, when no requests came from her rooms, when even those assigned to attend her could not say with certainty how she spent her time. Speculation increased, though always quietly. Some believed she was preparing to leave. Others believed she had already left in all but name. The truth, whatever it was, remained contained within a small circle. No official explanation was ever offered. This ambiguity allowed multiple narratives to coexist, none of them threatening enough to demand resolution. As months passed, the household settled into a new equilibrium. The crisis had not been resolved, but it had been contained. Containment was the goal. The enslaved woman learned to live with the knowledge that her child's life would be shaped by forces she could not resist. She also learned that survival depended on compliance, on minimizing her visibility, on accepting the limits imposed upon her. This acceptance was not consent. It was adaptation. Jefferson's wife, still absent, became a figure defined more by memory than presence. Those who had known her before spoke of her rarely, and when they did, it was in past tense, as though she belonged to a different era. Newer members of the household knew of her only as an idea, a name attached to closed rooms and unspoken history. This transformation from person to symbol marked the final stage of her disappearance. She had not been removed by force, but by neglect, by silence, by a collective decision not to acknowledge her suffering. The child grew, unaware of the circumstances of its conception, aware only of the world it inhabited. That world offered no explanations, only expectations. As the seasons changed, the plantation continued its work, producing goods, sustaining appearances, contributing to a system that depended on the erasure of stories like this one. Jefferson's legacy, still forming, moved forward unencumbered by these private realities. History would later debate his ideals, his contradictions, his place in the American narrative. But this chapter, like so many others, would remain unresolved, preserved only in fragments and inference. Section by section, absence by absence, the story advanced toward its quiet conclusion. The disappearance of Jefferson's wife was no longer an event but a condition, a permanent state that shaped the household without being acknowledged. What remained was a legacy built on silence, a silence so complete that it would take generations for anyone to question what had been lost within it. As time moved forward, the plantation learned to live with what it refused to explain. The disappearance of Jefferson's wife was never marked by a single moment that could be pointed to later as the end. Instead, it unfolded gradually until one day her absence felt permanent rather than temporary. There was no announcement, no recorded departure, no formal acknowledgement that she had stepped out of the life she once occupied. She simply ceased to exist in the daily consciousness of the household. Her rooms remained intact for a while, then slowly lost their significance. Dust gathered despite efforts to prevent it. Objects once carefully arranged were left where they were. Over time, even maintenance visits became less frequent. Preservation gave way to neglect, and neglect became acceptance. People stopped expecting to see her. The enslaved community, accustomed to sudden losses, recognized this pattern immediately. Disappearance did not always require removal. Sometimes it only required silence sustained long enough to feel normal. Jefferson continued forward without public disruption. His work carried on, his correspondence uninterrupted, his reputation unchallenged by rumors that lacked proof and advocates. The world beyond the plantation was not interested in questions that complicated admiration. Whatever private cost existed remained confined to those who had no means to broadcast it. The enslaved woman returned fully to labor as her body allowed, her life reduced again to utility. Her child grew under the same system that had defined her own existence, learning obedience before language, learning boundaries before freedom. No one explained to the child where they came from or why their life unfolded the way it did. Explanation was unnecessary within a system that relied on inevitability. The child belonged to the plantation in every way that mattered. Jefferson's wife, now functionally erased, became a figure of speculation for those who remembered her. Some believed she had chosen to leave, seeking distance from a reality she could not reconcile. Others believed she remained physically present but emotionally absent, withdrawing completely from engagement until life itself diminished. Without records, both possibilities survived side by side. History, when it lacks documentation, allows ambiguity to stand in for truth. This ambiguity served those with power. It prevented accountability while maintaining plausible dignity. The household adapted fully to her absence. New routines formed, new hierarchies solidified. What once felt like disruption faded into routine memory. Even the tension surrounding the birth dissipated as other concerns took precedence. This was how the system functioned. It absorbed conflict, smoothed it over, and moved on. The enslaved woman learned to live with the knowledge that her story would never be told in her own words. She existed in the margins of someone else's legacy, her experience reduced to implication rather than acknowledgement. Yet she remembered. Memory, though fragile, was hers alone. She carried it quietly, passing fragments of it to others in moments when privacy allowed. These fragments did not name names or assign blame openly. They simply described how things felt, how silence could be heavier than chains, how absence could wound more deeply than violence. Jefferson's wife, whether living elsewhere or confined within the estate, never re-entered the narrative. Her disappearance was complete not because she left, but because no one insisted on her return. In patriarchal systems, women's suffering often becomes invisible once it stops serving a purpose. Her refusal to participate further may have been her final act of resistance, a withdrawal that denied legitimacy to what had happened. If so, it was a resistance that carried its own cost. She forfeited presence, influence, and recognition in exchange for distance. Whether this choice brought her peace is unknown. The record remains silent. As years passed, the plantation continued to operate, producing wealth and sustaining appearances. Jefferson's public image solidified, his words preserved, his ideas debated and celebrated. The private contradictions that shaped his household remained largely unexamined. When they were mentioned, they were softened by time, reframed as rumors, dismissed as exaggerations. The enslaved woman and her child were never invited into those discussions. Their lives were not considered relevant to the evaluation of greatness. This selective memory shaped the historical record that followed. The story, such as it is, survives not through official documents, but through inference, through gaps that invite questions. The disappearance of Jefferson's wife remains one of those gaps, a silence that speaks only if someone is willing to listen closely. It reminds us that history is not only what is written, but what is omitted. It is shaped by who had the power to speak and who did not. This case, silence protected a legacy while erasing lives that complicated it. The enslaved woman grew older within the system that had defined her from birth, her child inheriting the same constraints. Their story did not end with resolution or justice. It ended with continuation, with survival in a world that offered little else. Jefferson's wife faded from memory almost entirely, remembered only by those who had witnessed her withdrawal and understood its meaning. To later generations, she became a name without context, a presence without detail. The truth of what she endured remained locked within the private spaces she abandoned. This is how many American stories conclude, not with clarity, but with silence preserved as dignity. The plantation stood, the legacy endured, and the unanswered questions remained buried beneath layers of admiration and forgetfulness. What lingers now is not proof, but possibility, a recognition that beneath celebrated histories lie quieter truths shaped by imbalance, fear, and erasure. The story does not ask for judgment as much as it demands awareness. It exists as a reminder that disappearance can occur without movement, that absence can be enforced without chains, and that the cost of silence is often paid by those whose voices were never recorded.